This is The Guest Who Came Twice, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the heart of darkness. First, we would like to greatly thank our listeners from all over the world. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and write a comment telling us where you're listening from. Tonight's question is a curious one. Have you ever welcomed someone into your home, only to feel, much later, that they should never have crossed the threshold at all? Dim your lights, pour yourself a tisane worthy of Monsieur Poirot, and prepare to exercise your own little grey cells. Chapter 1. The Terrace of Perfect People. "Two returning guests," said the young man, raising his glass. "The best kind." It was, on the surface, a perfectly charming toast. The champagne was excellent. The evening light lay across the terrace of the Hotel Miraggio in long, honey-coloured bars, and below the marble balustrade, the Tyrrhenian sea glowed with that particular shade of cobalt blue which painters attempt and seldom achieve. Jasmine climbed the white stone in soft profusion. The napery was heavy Italian linen, pressed to a severity that Hercule Poirot himself found satisfying. The waiters moved with the silent precision of men who understood that their invisibility was part of the luxury on offer. It was, in every particular, paradise. Poirot adjusted the cream gloves that lay folded beside his plate and permitted himself a small measure of contentment. He had been invited to the Miraggio by his old acquaintance, Monsieur Gérard Fontaine, a Belgian financier of considerable wealth and, more importantly, in Poirot's estimation, impeccable taste. The gathering was private, the guest list curated with the care one applied to a rare cellar. One did not simply arrive at the Miraggio. One was admitted. Poirot sipped his champagne and observed the company. The woman who commanded the terrace without appearing to try was called Elena Varga. She was Hungarian by birth and legendary by reputation, an art patron of international standing whose beauty was of the variety that caused conversations to momentarily lose their thread. Her hair, the precise colour of warm honey, was pinned with an antique sapphire comb. Her dress was pale silver silk. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the quality of velvet drawn slowly across a polished surface, and every eye followed her as she moved between tables with the ease of a woman who had long since ceased to notice the attention. Poirot noticed something else. Even when she supposed herself unobserved, during the fraction of a second when a woman may allow her expression to rest, Elena Varga's smile remained precisely, identically, the same. It did not waver, did not soften, did not disappear. It was maintained with the constancy of a professional effort. Poirot found this more interesting than her beauty. Her host was Alessandro Bellini, and one had only to observe the terrace for 5 minutes to understand that every pleasure it offered existed by his permission. He was tall, silver-haired, and wore his navy linen jacket with the unself-conscious authority of a man for whom clothes had long ago ceased to require thought. He owned the Miraggio hotel chain, among other things. The weekend gathering was his composition, and the guests were his audience. He laughed freely, and those around him laughed slightly too freely in return, which Poirot noted was the reliable symptom of money in proximity to ambition. When Elena Varga turned to speak to the young man beside her, Poirot observed Bellini's fingers tighten, briefly, on the stem of his glass. The gesture was small, controlled, and immediately suppressed. a man who had learned to govern his emotions, but not quite quickly enough. The young man in question was Lucas Duarte, a Brazilian venture capitalist of whom Poirot had read occasional mentions in the financial press. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-eyed, and possessed of the particular social fluency that belongs to men who have educated themselves in the manners of a world they were not born into. He wore his confidence as well as his clothes, which was to say, extremely well. Yet Poirot, watching him across the rim of his glass, observed that Duarte's gaze moved constantly. He was always in some region of his attention, surveying the room. Not with anxiety, but with the habitual calculation of a chess player who cannot cease to count positions even when the game is nominally at rest. Isabelle Laurent occupied a chair somewhat removed from the central warmth of the gathering, though her composure was such that one might easily have supposed she had chosen the position deliberately. She was French, formerly the wife of Alessandro Bellini, and currently the editor of a Parisian fashion periodical of considerable influence. She was perhaps 50, and beautiful in the manner that requires intelligence to sustain, which is a more durable beauty than the other kind. She drank her champagne with perfect equanimity. Her eyes, however, told a different story, moving at intervals toward Bellini and Elena Varga, with an expression of such precise, unblinking attention that Poirot was reminded of a surgeon studying a wound. Near the inner doors to the hotel, almost never in the foreground, stood Mei Chen. She was Bellini's personal assistant, American-born of Chinese descent, and her efficiency was evidently of the highest order, since the complex machinery of the weekend appeared to run without friction. She carried a leather folio and wore an expression of pleasant neutrality. Poirot had observed in a long career that people spoke with remarkable candour in front of those they had unconsciously designated as furniture. He himself had never made that error. The remaining young man, Oliver Bellini, was Alessandro's son by his first marriage, and carried the particular unhappiness of the very young and very wealthy, which is to say, he possessed everything except a reason to want any of it. He was handsome in a blurred, unfinished way, and spoke little. It was Adrian Sato who captured Poirot's attention most fully. He was perhaps 35, Japanese-British in appearance, and a documentary filmmaker of some repute. He was not the wealthiest guest, nor the most striking, and his suit, while perfectly adequate, was not in the same conversation as Bellini's linen. But there was about him a quality which Poirot, in his long experience of human nature, recognized as genuinely rare in precisely this sort of company. He was authentic. He laughed when something amused him. Not a moment before, he listened when others spoke with the attention of a man who finds people genuinely interesting rather than strategically useful. When he raised his glass for his toast, there was no performance in the gesture. He simply meant it. Poirot liked him immediately, and immediately distrusted the liking, for in his experience, people one liked immediately in such circumstances had a way of becoming victims. 2 returning guests, Sato had said. The best kind. Bellini had flinched. It was swift and small, the merest contraction about the eyes. But Poirot did not miss swift and small things, and Elena Varga had been still for perhaps 1 second longer than the pause warranted. Lucas Duarte had lowered his gaze to his glass. 3 people, 3 reactions. 1 unremarkable toast. Poirot tilted his egg-shaped head very slightly to one side and said nothing. The evening continued in the manner of such evenings, with the seamless replacement of one pleasure by another. The champagne gave way to dinner. The dinner was, as one expected, superb. The conversations sparkled with the professional ease of people who had long ago learned that one does not discuss anything of actual importance at a dinner table. Afterwards, in the cooler dark of the late evening, Adrian Sato found his way to Poirot's small table at the terrace's edge. He sat without ceremony and was quiet for a moment, looking at the sea below. "Monsieur Poirot," he said at last. He spoke without preamble, which Poirot respected. Some guests arrive twice at a hotel like this, once under their own name, once under another. Poirot regarded him with calm attention. "That is a most interesting observation, Monsieur Sato, isn't it?" Sato looked at him with a slight smile that held behind its pleasantness something careful. "I thought so." He rose, wished Poirot a good evening, and went inside. Poirot remained at his table. Below the balustrade, the sea glittered under a thin moon, shifting and secretive and very beautiful. The scent of bergamot drifted in on the warm air, and somewhere inside the hotel, a clock chimed the hour with small, measured strokes. He thought about a toast that had produced 3 involuntary reactions. He thought about a smile that never rested. He thought about the curious tension in a wealthy man's fingers. He thought, above all, about the particular phrasing a documentary filmmaker had chosen to deliver a warning, for Poirot had no doubt that it was a warning to a man he had only just met. A guest who arrives twice, he reflected, once under one name, once under another. In Poirot's experience, such arrangements were rarely entered into for innocent reasons. He finished his champagne, noted with approval that it was still at the correct temperature, and folded his gloves with care. Paradise, he thought. How very suspicious. Chapter 2. The Second Arrival. The dining room of the Hotel Miraggio held, at its centre, a table set for 8, and at that table 7 people performed the ancient and elaborate ritual of pretending they were simply having dinner. Poirot, who had attended a great many such performances in his time, settled into his chair and unfolded his napkin with the appreciation of a man who recognizes quality linen and finds it soothing. Around him, the candles shed their careful light. The cutlery was heavy silver. The flowers were white and odorless, chosen, he noted with approval, by someone who understood that scent competes with food. The first course arrived. Elena Varga wore at her throat a necklace of sapphires set in white gold. The stones were large and very fine, arranged in a graduated drop that would have commanded serious attention in any jeweller's window on the Place Vendôme. Poirot admired it with the dispassion of a man who admires many things without being distracted by them. Then he glanced, briefly and without any appearance of doing so, at Isabelle Laurent. Isabelle Laurent was looking at the necklace. Her expression did not change. Her fork did not pause. But the quality of her stillness altered very slightly in the manner of a woman absorbing a deliberate affront with the whole of her considerable self-discipline. Poirot filed the observation away and attended to his risotto. Conversation at the table moved with the practiced fluency of the internationally travelled. Bellini spoke of a new hotel development on the Dalmatian coast. Lucas Duarte offered observations on Southeast Asian investment climates, with the fluency of a man who had recently studied the subject with professional urgency. Oliver Bellini ate in near silence and refilled his wineglass with a regularity his father observed and chose not to address. And Adrian Sato listened to everyone with equal attention and spoke with the unhurried ease of a man who was in no competition with anyone at the table. He asked Isabelle Laurent about a Parisian exhibition she had recently attended, and the gratitude in her eyes, slight but genuine, at being addressed as a person of cultural substance rather than merely a former wife, was not lost on Poirot. It was approximately halfway through the second course that Lucas Duarte excused himself from the table. He returned 12 minutes later. Poirot had counted the minutes with the same unconscious precision with which he noted everything, and he observed that Duarte had changed his jacket. He had gone in wearing pale linen and returned in black. The substitution was performed with perfect nonchalance, accompanied by a brief word to his neighbour about the evening air having turned cool, which was, Poirot noted, not especially true. The black jacket, the 12 minutes, the hour, which was now approaching midnight. Poirot looked at his champagne and thought about these things. Adrian Sato left the table shortly after. He said something light to Oliver Bellini as he rose, something that produced a reluctant smile in the young man, and then he was gone through the inner doors to the corridor beyond. Poirot watched him go with the detached attention he gave to things he did not yet understand. 10 minutes passed. The table continued without him. Elena Varga turned the full luminosity of her attention upon Bellini. Then Bellini received it with the satisfaction of a man who has spent a great deal of money and finds the expenditure justified. Isabelle Laurent spoke quietly to Mei Chen about the schedule for the following morning. Oliver Bellini stared at the middle distance and thought private thoughts. Then the door opened and Adrian Sato returned. He resumed his seat with an easy apology for his absence and addressed a pleasantry to Elena Varga that made her laugh, a laugh that was warmer than most of her expressions, and therefore, Poirot suspected, less rehearsed. The table absorbed his return without interruption. Poirot studied him. The easy smile was the same. The unhurried manner was identical. But Adrian Sato's hair, which had been dry when he left the table, now carried the faint dampness of recent contact with water. And the jacket he wore, though similar in cut and colour to the one he had left in, was not, Poirot was quite certain, the same jacket. A small thing. But Poirot had built an entire career upon the architecture of small things. He helped himself to a sliver of the cheese that had just arrived, and considered the question of why a man steps away from a dinner table and returns 10 minutes later with damp hair and a changed jacket. The most obvious explanation was that something had occurred to require it. A spill, perhaps, an encounter with the sea spray on one of the lower terraces. But the hair suggested water more deliberate than sea spray, and the jacket was not a hasty substitution, but a considered one, since it fitted him equally well and was of equivalent quality. Nobody else at the table had noticed, or if they had, yet they had decided, with the particular social tact of their world, not to. After dinner, the company dispersed to the terrace for the serving of digestifs, and Poirot found himself momentarily beside Mei Chen at the balustrade. She stood looking out at the dark sea with a composure that was, he thought, genuine rather than performed. In his experience, composure of the genuine variety was rarer and more interesting than the other kind. "A beautiful evening," Poirot remarked. "It always is here," she replied without inflection. You have attended many of Monsieur Bellini's private gatherings. Several. She glanced at him with the mild alertness of a woman who is not deceived by sociable openings. You are observant, Monsieur Poirot. People mention it. People are kind, said Poirot pleasantly. Tell me, Mademoiselle Chen, Monsieur Sato. He has been a guest of Monsieur Bellini before, I think. Something shifted briefly behind her careful eyes. I manage schedules, she said, not histories. It was neatly done. Poirot smiled and didn't press further. Across the terrace, Bellini stood apart from the group, a glass of grappa held loosely in one hand, looking out over the sea. Adrian Sato approached him with the directness of a man who has decided to have a conversation and sees no advantage in postponing it. Whatever passed between them was conducted in voices too low to carry. But Poirot observed that Bellini did not turn to face Sato for the duration of it. He kept his gaze on the water, and when Sato moved away, Bellini remained motionless for a long moment before rejoining his guests with a smile of recovered ease that was, Poirot thought, very nearly convincing. Poirot walked to the far end of the terrace where the jasmine grew most thickly and the light from the dining-room windows did not quite reach. The air was warm and very still. Below, the sea moved in slow, dark swells. From an open balcony door above him, a voice reached him with the clarity that still night air sometimes lends to sound. It was Bellini's voice, low and controlled, with something beneath the control that had not been there at dinner. You should not have come back, he said. A pause. Then Adrian Sato's voice, calm and without apology. I already did. The balcony door drew closed. Poirot stood in the jasmine-scented dark and considered the phrase with the care it deserved. Not, I was always going to come. Not, you could not have stopped me. I already did. The past tense. The thing accomplished. A return that had preceded its own announcement. A guest who arrives twice, Sato had said, once under one name, once under another. Poirot looked up at the darkened balcony. Then he looked down at the sea, which glittered with perfect indifference. Somewhere in this beautiful, expensive, and deeply dishonest gathering, something had already been set in motion. He could feel it the way one feels a change in atmospheric pressure, not yet visible but certain. He returned to the terrace, declined a second digestive with thanks, and wished his host a composed good night. In his room, before he slept, Poirot straightened the objects on his dressing table with habitual precision. The silver-backed brushes at parallel angles, the small bottle of lavender water exactly centered on its cloth, and the travel clock positioned so its face caught the first light. Order, he believed, was not merely an aesthetic preference. It was a discipline of mind. A man who kept his surroundings exact, kept his thinking exact. And exact thinking in the days ahead was going to be required. He was quite sure of that. Chapter 3. Death by Moonlight. The scream came at 20 minutes past 6. Poirot was already awake. He had been awake since 5, lying in the precise centre of his bed with the stillness of a man whose mind, once engaged upon a problem, declines to release it for the convenience of sleep. He had been thinking about past tenses and changed jackets and a smile that never rested. He had been thinking, with some unease, about the particular quality of certainty in Adrian Sato's voice. I already did. When the scream reached him, much sharp and truncated as though the person producing it had immediately thought better of it, Poirot was out of bed with a speed that would have surprised those who underestimated him. which was a great many people and entirely their own misfortune. He dressed with non-negotiable thoroughness. In a crisis, he had found, the man who arrives correctly dressed retains an authority that the man in a dressing gown does not. 6 minutes after the scream, Hercule Poirot walked along the upper corridor of the Hotel Miraggio, with his moustaches in perfect order, and his shoes, despite the hour, gleaming. The door to Adrian Sato's private balcony suite stood open. Mei Chen was in the doorway. She had both hands pressed flat against the doorframe, as though she required its support, and her face had the particular greyish quality that belongs to people who have seen something they cannot immediately rationalize. She was still in last night's clothes. Poirot noted this without comment. Inside, through the open balcony doors, the early light lay pale and flat across the marble. And in that light, Adrian Sato sat at a small iron table with the composed stillness of a man who has finished his dinner and is waiting for nothing further. He was, of course, dead. The table had been set for two. Poirot absorbed this detail with the quiet attention it deserved. 2 chairs, 2 champagne flutes, one empty and one full. A plate of white truffle risotto, barely touched, its surface now cool and set. A white linen napkin folded at his right hand with a neatness that struck Poirot as posthumous, since men in the act of dying do not generally attend to their napkins. Sato himself sat with his hands resting in his lap, his head inclined very slightly forward, as though considering a thought of mild interest. His lips carried at their corners the faint blue tinge that Poirot recognized without pleasure and without the need for a laboratory to confirm it. Poison, administered with the meal or with the champagne or after. Sufficient time for him to be seated, composed, perhaps aware of what was happening, and without the will or the means to summon help. The staged quality of the scene was not lost on Poirot. The folded napkin, the full champagne flute left, he suspected, by the other party. The careful positioning of a man who had been, in life, so markedly untheatrical. Someone had arranged this, or someone had allowed it to resolve itself into arrangement, which was a subtler thing. Behind him in the corridor, other doors were opening. Bellini appeared in a dark silk robe, his silver hair still disordered from sleep, and took in the scene with eyes that registered shock and, beneath the shock, something that Poirot watched for and found. A shutting down of expression, swift and deliberate, as a man draws a blind across a lit window. Oliver Bellini appeared behind his father, looked once at the balcony, and went very pale. Lucas Duarte arrived last among the men, his dark hair smooth, wearing a light grey jacket over his shirt. He had dressed, Poirot noted, more quickly and more completely than anyone else. Elena Varga did not appear for some minutes. When she did, and she stood in the corridor with her silk robe drawn close and looked through the open door with an expression that Poirot studied with great care. It was the expression of a woman experiencing grief. The eyes were bright, the jaw held tight against some interior collapse. It was, he thought, the most genuinely unguarded face he had seen her produce in his entire acquaintance with her. That told him something, though precisely what, he was not yet prepared to say. Isabelle Laurent arrived and said nothing at all. She stood slightly apart, looked at the scene with a steadiness that was different from callousness, and then looked at Bellini. Bellini did not look back. Poirot stepped onto the balcony. The morning was cloudless. Below, the sea had taken on its daytime colour, a deep, impervious blue that seemed to belong to a different world, entirely from the one transpiring on this terrace. A small pleasure boat moved distantly across the water, indifferent and unhurried. He did not touch the body. He stood beside the table and looked, with the careful, systematic patience that was his particular gift, at everything available to be seen. The champagne in the full glass was of the same vintage as that served at dinner. The plate of risotto matched the kitchen's menu for private in-suite dining, available upon request until midnight. The iron table was small, suited to intimate dining, and the two chairs were positioned as they would be for people who intended to look at the view as much as at each other. An intimate dinner for two, on a private balcony, in the small hours of the morning. But someone had come here willingly, dined with him, and left. Poirot crouched slowly and with dignity, and examined the floor beneath the second chair. The marble was clean, but against the inner leg of the chair, almost invisible, was a faint, pale smear. He looked at it for some time without touching it. Then he straightened and went inside. Adrian Sato's room was orderly in the manner of a man who was naturally tidy rather than anxiously so. A camera case on the desk, expensive and worn with use. Books stacked with their spines aligned. A glass of water by the bed, half finished. On the writing table, weighted by the water glass he had evidently carried across for the purpose, was the cheap leather notebook Poirot had observed at dinner. Its cover was soft with handling, darkened at the edges. Poirot regarded it. Then he opened the drawer of the writing table. Empty. Not merely unoccupied, but empty in the particular way of a drawer that has recently been relieved of its contents. A rectangle of faint dust marked where something flat had rested. Papers, perhaps, or an envelope. He looked at the notebook again. It was not the instinct of a tidy man to weight a notebook with a water glass, unless he had considered that the notebook might otherwise be moved, or taken. An improvised anchor of a sort. Poirot opened it. The pages were dense with notes in a small, legible hand. Interview transcripts mostly. Names he did not recognize alongside fragments of recollection, anecdotes, observed contradictions. Documentary research, clearly. But at the back of the book, tucked inside the rear cover rather than written on the page, was a folded receipt. He unfolded it with care. It was from a private identity verification service based in Monaco. The document was in French, formal and brief. A service had been rendered. The fee was €3 million. The client of record was Alessandro Bellini. The named beneficiary of the verification was one Adrian Sato. Poirot read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it in the breast pocket of his jacket with the deliberateness of a man who understands that he is holding something that will require a great deal of explaining. €3 million. Paid by a man to verify the identity of a documentary filmmaker. Not to suppress it, to verify it. Unless, of course, the verification had been of someone else entirely, and Adrian Sato's name had appeared on the document for reasons of convenience or concealment, or something considerably more complicated than either. He returned to the corridor. The others had gathered in a loose cluster near the staircase. Bellini had recovered his composure with impressive speed and was speaking in a low voice to Mei Chen, who was writing in her folio. Organizing, Poirot assumed the necessary telephone calls, the Italian authorities, the hotel doctor, the quiet machinery of crisis management in establishments that cannot afford visible distress. Poirot paused in the doorway and addressed the assembled company without preliminary. I should be grateful, he said pleasantly, if no one were to leave the hotel today. There will be questions, naturellement. There are always questions, and in my experience the answers are invariably somewhere in the room. He looked at each of them in turn with the mild, attentive gaze they had perhaps not yet learned to find alarming. Somewhere very close, he added, and went to order his breakfast. Chapter 4. The Beautiful Liars. The Italian authorities arrived at 9:30 in the form of a single inspector from the Salerno division, a lean, sun-darkened man named Ferrara, who surveyed the Hotel Miraggio's terrace with the expression of someone who has been asked to investigate a crime in a location that costs more per night than his monthly salary, and finds the irony unremarkable. He spoke adequate English, examined the balcony suite with professional efficiency, and had a brief conversation with Poirot that left him looking simultaneously relieved and vaguely suspicious, which was the effect Poirot generally produced on official investigators. "You will conduct your own inquiries, Monsieur Poirot," Ferrara said. It was not quite a question. "I will have conversations," Poirot replied pleasantly. "I am, after all, merely a guest." Ferrara looked at him and said nothing further on the subject. By 11 o'clock, Poirot had arranged, through Machen's cooperation and Bellini's stiff-shouldered acquiescence, the use of a small ground-floor sitting room that looked onto the hotel's lemon garden. It was quiet there and private, and the light came in at a low angle that illuminated faces rather than flattered them. Poirot appreciated the light. He arranged 2 chairs with their precise degree of separation, placed his notebook on the table beside him, and sent word that he would be grateful for a few minutes of each guest's time. He began with Elena Varga. She arrived wearing a dress of pale ivory linen, her hair drawn back simply, the sapphire comb absent. Without it, she looked, not diminished, but different. Younger, perhaps, more provisional. She sat with the straight-backed ease of a woman who has spent years being looked at and has made her peace with it. And she met Poirot's gaze with a directness that was either confidence or its excellent imitation. "A terrible thing," she said before he could speak. Her voice was controlled, the warmth in it carefully measured. He was a gifted man. "You knew him well?" Poirot asked. "One knew Adrian, or one did not. There was no middle distance with him." She paused. "I knew him a little. We had met before, socially. Budapest some years ago, and once in London." "You slept early last evening, I understand." "I did. The journey had tired me." She held his gaze without difficulty. I was in my room by 10 o'clock. My maid can confirm it." Poirot noted that she had offered the confirmation before he requested it. He noted also that she had said Budapest, without any alteration of expression, with the ease of a woman to whom the word carries no particular weight. "Of course," he said. "You are most helpful, Madame Varga. One final thing, purely from curiosity. The sapphire necklace you wore at dinner. It is a remarkable piece." Something moved behind her eyes. Swift, controlled, gone. "A gift," she said, "from Alessandro." "Quite so." Poirot smiled with great benevolence and wrote nothing in his notebook. "Thank you, madame. You have been most kind." After she left, he sat for a moment in the yellow garden light and thought about the confirmation offered unprompted, and the smile that had, for the first time in his observation of her, flickered. Alessandro Bellini came next, and he came as a man who owns the room he enters, which was perhaps unavoidable, given that he literally did. He sat with his hands flat on his knees, and addressed Poirot with the measured courtesy of someone who has decided that cooperation is the most efficient posture. "I was with investors last night," he said. "A telephone conference with Singapore. It ran from 10 until nearly midnight. May has the call logs." "Efficiente," said Poirot approvingly. "And Monsieur Sato? You knew him previously?" Bellini's jaw set by a fraction. "We had met, professional acquaintances." "A documentary filmmaker and a hotel chain proprietor. An interesting professional acquaintance." "I have many interests beyond hotels." The tone was not quite curt. "I support cultural work, film, among other things." "You are most generous," Poirot agreed. "Tell me, Monsieur Bellini, the conversation you had with Monsieur Sato on the terrace last night, after dinner. It appeared briefly, how shall I say, intense." The pause was 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than a man with nothing to conceal requires. "He was asking about a project. I told him it was not the right moment." "Quite so." Poirot wrote something this time and had the quiet satisfaction of watching Bellini resist the urge to see what it was. "Thank you, monsieur." Lucas Duarte settled into the chair opposite with a looseness of posture that was too studied to be genuine relaxation. He was a man, Poirot had concluded, who expressed confidence physically when he felt it least. "Midnight phone call," Duarte said, arch with a brief smile. "Before you ask, my business partner in Sao Paulo, we are managing a significant restructuring. At midnight. Time zones are the tax one pays for being international." The smile held. Poirot looked at him with mild interest. "And the jacket?" Duarte's smile did not falter, which told Poirot that he had prepared for the question. "Spilled wine on the first one, changed before rejoining the terrace. Of course, 12 minutes is perhaps a little long for so simple an operation, but no matter." Poirot waved a hand dismissively. "One can never find things in an unfamiliar room. It is most vexing." Duarte said nothing. The smile was still in position, but its quality had changed in the way of a structure that remains standing after something load-bearing has been removed. Isabelle Laurent was the fourth. As she sat without any of the studied composure of the others, which was itself a kind of composure. She wore no jewellery. Her hands rested open in her lap. "I read last evening," she said, "alone in my room. I have no one to confirm it, and I did not expect to need one." She looked at him steadily. "I did not kill Adrian Sato, Monsieur Poirot. I had no reason to." "You had no quarrel with him?" "I barely knew him. He was Oliver's friend, primarily." A pause. "He was kind to Oliver. I noticed that." "And Monsieur Bellini? You maintain a civil relationship with your former husband?" Something in her face contracted briefly, like a light source reduced. "We are civil," she said. "That is precisely the word." "The necklace Madame Varga wore at dinner," Poirot said with the air of a man raising a trivial afterthought. You recognized it, I think." Isabelle was quiet for a moment. "It was mine," she said at last, with a flatness that was more affecting than any heat could have been. "Alessandro gave it to me in the first year of our marriage. I left it at the Milan apartment when we separated. I had not seen it since." She rose before he could speak again. "If that is all, Monsieur Poirot." It was not all, but it was enough for the moment. Oliver Bellini came last, and his appearance confirmed Poirot's impression of a young man carrying a burden slightly too large for his frame. His eyes were red at the rims. He had been crying, which distinguished him from every other person Poirot had spoken to that morning. "He was my friend," Oliver said without preface, and the simplicity of it was striking after so much careful construction. He was actually my friend, not a contact or an investor or a useful connection. A friend. Tell me about the documentary, Poirot said gently. Oliver looked up. He told you. He indicated he was working on something personal. It was about people like me. The young man turned his glass of water in his hands. People who inherit everything and understand nothing. Who feel like imposters in their own lives. Adrian said it was the most interesting kind of loneliness because nobody believes it exists. He paused. He understood people. That was his gift. He could see what people actually were, underneath everything they'd constructed. It made him remarkable. I expect it also made him dangerous. Poirot regarded the young man carefully. Did you see him after dinner last evening? No, I went to my room early. I had drunk too much. He said it without self-pity. I wish I hadn't. After Oliver left, Poirot remained in the lemon garden room for some minutes alone. Outside, the gardener moved between the trees with a long-handled tool, unhurried, absorbed in the ordinary maintenance of beautiful things. 4 alibis, telephone logs, a maid, time zones, and solitude. All of them plausible. Each of them, in its own way, just slightly too considered. He thought about what Oliver had said. Adrian Sato had possessed the ability to see what people actually were, underneath everything they had constructed. In a gathering composed entirely of constructions, that was not a gift. It was a threat. And someone at the Hotel Miraggio had understood that with sufficient clarity to act upon it. Poirot picked up his notebook, stood, and squared his shoulders with the small private resolution of a man who has identified the shape of a problem and is now prepared to begin the real work. The lemon trees outside moved very gently in the morning air. He went to find Mei Chen. Chapter 5. The Interviews. Mei Chen was in the hotel's administrative office, a room that existed in deliberate contrast to everything surrounding it. Functional where the rest of the Miraggio was luxurious, fluorescent where all else was candlelit. She sat at a desk occupied by neat columns of paper, a laptop, and a telephone that had apparently been in continuous use since 7 that morning. She looked up when Poirot appeared in the doorway and did not look particularly surprised to see him. I wondered when you would come here, she said. And I wondered, Poirot replied, on settling into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. Why you were in last night's clothes when the scream woke the hotel. She considered him for a moment with the evaluating calm that he had observed in her from the first evening. Then she closed the laptop with quiet finality. I had not slept. No, I thought not. He folded his hands in his lap. You were aware that something was wrong. I was aware that Monsieur Sato had requested the private dining service at 11:15, in suite for 2 people. I processed the order myself because the night manager had gone to deal with a difficulty at the boat dock. She paused. He had not struck me as a man who entertained privately at midnight. He struck me as a man who slept at reasonable hours and woke early. So I stayed awake. But you did not intervene. I did not know there was anything to intervene in. I only knew that something felt incorrect. She said it without apology, and without, Poirot noted, the defensive elaboration that accompanies dishonesty. By the time I felt certain enough to go to the corridor, it was nearly 5. I listened at the door. There was no sound. I went back to my room and sat in the chair until 6, when I went back and found the door unlocked. You found him? Yes. Poirot was quiet for a moment, regarding her with attention. The order for private dining. It was placed in Monsieur Sato's name? It was placed from his room telephone. Yes. And the second setting, the second glass. Someone joined him who was not a registered guest of the suite. Or someone who was known to the night kitchen staff and therefore not questioned. She said it precisely, like a woman who has already followed the thread to its conclusion and is simply waiting for the right moment to hand it over. Tell me, Mademoiselle Chen, in your time with Monsieur Bellini, his guests, his arrangements, have you encountered the name Ilona Kovacs? The name produced a reaction that was, by Mei Chen's standards, pronounced. Her hands, which had been resting loosely on the desk, drew inward by a centimetre. Her eyes held his for a half-second longer than was natural before she said, "No." Poirot smiled pleasantly. "Thank you. You have been, as always, most efficient." He left her sitting very still in the fluorescent light and walked back through the hotel's cool interior corridors towards the terrace, thinking about a name that a woman who managed every schedule and every private arrangement had chosen to deny knowing. The terrace at midday was largely deserted. The other guests had retreated to their rooms or to the shaded lower gardens in the manner of people who require privacy to maintain their composure. The waiters moved with subdued efficiency, clearing the morning's coffee things, resetting for luncheon that would, Poirot suspected, go largely uneaten. Lucas Duarte was at the far end of the terrace, standing at the balustrade with a telephone pressed to his ear. His conversation was in Portuguese, conducted in a rapid undertone with the urgency of a man whose news is unwelcome and whose options are narrowing. Poirot did not speak Portuguese with any fluency, but he spoke the language of financial distress, which is universal and requires no translation. The tight shoulders, the compressed intervals between responses, the single moment when Duarte lowered the telephone and pressed 2 fingers briefly against his closed eyes before raising it again. A man managing a crisis that predated the one currently occupying the hotel. Poirot walked past him without stopping, descended to the lower garden by the stone steps, and found Oliver Bellini sitting on a bench in the thin shade of an umbrella pine, turning Adrian Sato's cheap leather notebook in his hands. Poirot stopped. "Where did you find that?" he asked, and with a quietness that was not gentle. Oliver looked up. He did not appear guilty so much as lost. "It was in my room, under the door this morning, before the scream. I didn't know what to do with it." "Someone put it under your door." "Yes." He held it out. "I didn't read it. I opened it, but I didn't read past the first page. It felt wrong." Poirot took the notebook. The receipt, he confirmed with a rapid interior check, was still in his breast pocket, removed during his morning examination of the room. Someone had delivered the notebook to Oliver then, without its most material enclosure, either because they did not know it was there or because they had removed it first. He sat down beside the young man on the bench. "Oliver, I want you to think carefully. Your father and Monsieur Sato. Was there an earlier connection between them? Before this gathering?" Oliver picked at a thread on his sleeve. "Dad never mentioned him. But I met Adrian 8 months ago in London at a screening. He already knew who I was. He said he'd done his research." He paused. "I assumed it was professional. Adrian always did his research." "And when you told your father you were collaborating with Sato on the documentary?" The thread came loose. Oliver rolled it between his fingers. He told me it was a poor idea, that Sato was not what he appeared to be, that I should be careful. He looked sideways at Poirot. Dad says that about most people. But about Sato specifically? About Sato, he said it twice. Poirot turned the notebook over in his hands once. Then he said gently, but without hesitation, "Did you know that your father paid 3 million euros to a private identity service in Monaco, with Sato named as the beneficiary?" Oliver was very still for a moment. Then, "No, that makes no sense." "On the contrary," Poirot said, almost to himself, "it begins to make a very great deal of sense." He rose, tucked the notebook into his jacket beside the receipt, and looked down at the young man with something approaching sympathy. "You liked him because he was honest. That is not a small thing, mon ami. In this company, it is a very rare one." He climbed the stone steps back to the main terrace. Elena Varga was there. She stood at the balustrade in the identical spot where, the previous evening, Bellini had received Sato's quiet address and refused to turn his face. But she was looking at the sea with an expression that Poirot had not seen her wear before, unguarded and remote, as though she had briefly forgotten to maintain herself. He did not announce his approach. He simply came to stand beside her, as Sato had stood beside Bellini, and looked at the water. After a moment she said, without turning, "He was a good man." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "There are not very many of them." "No," said Poirot, "there are not." She was quiet for a long time. The sea moved below in its enormous, unhurried way. When she spoke again, her voice had lost what remained of its managed warmth, and was something thinner and more real beneath. "He believed in things," she said, "even after there was no particular reason to." Poirot did not reply because there was nothing in the words that required a reply. Yet what they required was a witness, and he was standing there. After a moment she seemed to become aware of herself, and straightened, almost imperceptibly, as the performance resumed its post. "Forgive me," she said. "The heat makes one sentimental." "Of course," said Poirot. He watched her return across the terrace with her perfect carriage and her ivory dress and her managed grace, and he thought about what she had not said, which was considerably more informative than what she had. He believed in things even after there was no particular reason to. A woman describing a man who had continued to love her after she had given him every reason to stop. The sea glittered. The jasmine swayed. On the terrace of the Hotel Miraggio, Hercule Poirot stood quite still for a full minute, and several things that had been moving independently in his mind arrived, with the quiet precision of well-made clockwork at the same positions simultaneously. He needed, he decided, to find out a great deal more about the woman who had once been called Ilona Kovacs. He went inside to think. Chapter 6. The Hidden Economy. The lemon garden at 2 in the afternoon was very quiet and very hot, and Hercule Poirot sat in its deepest shade with his notebook open on his knee and conducted, entirely within the privacy of his own mind, the interview he had been working toward since the previous evening. He was interviewing in his imagination the Hotel Miraggio itself. A place he had long believed spoke as plainly as its inhabitants if one knew how to listen. The Miraggio spoke of money that had ceased to need to prove itself, of a world so accustomed to beauty that beauty had become simply the minimum acceptable condition. It spoke of people who had arrived at the summit of what money could provide and discovered, with varying degrees of grace, that the summit had a great deal of weather. He wrote 3 columns in his notebook. At the head of each, he placed a name: Elena Varga, Alessandro Bellini, Lucas Duarte. Under Elena's name, he wrote 5 million annually, Bellini sauce, Budapest, Ilona Kovac, sapphire necklace, unprompted alibi, flickered on the name of the city. Believed in things. Under Bellini's name, he wrote Monaco receipt, 3 million. Identity verification. Prior knowledge of Sato told Oliver twice to be careful. Did not look at Sato on the terrace. Isabel's necklace on Elena's throat. Under Duarte's name, he wrote black jacket, 12 minutes, midnight. Bankrupt, Portuguese telephone, São Paulo creditors. Too smooth on the jacket question. He looked at the 3 columns for some time. Then he drew a line beneath them and wrote a 4th name: Adrian Sato. Under Sato's name, he wrote authentic, notebook, receipt, documentary, Oliver, Budapest, came twice. I already did. He closed the notebook and pressed his fingertips together in the attitude that those who knew him recognized as the outward sign of inward industry. The Monaco receipt was the keystone of the arch. 3 million euros paid by Bellini, beneficiary Sato. It was not, Poirot had concluded, a payment for silence. A man paying for silence does not place the recipient's name on the document in a form retrievable by a visiting Belgian detective. It was, rather, the record of an agreement, and an agreement that one party had considered settled and the other had apparently reconsidered. He required more specific information than the receipt itself provided, and for this he required a telephone and a contact in Monaco who owed him a professional courtesy, which was a category of person Poirot maintained with the same careful organization he brought to everything else. He went to his room and made the call. Monsieur Aristide Marchetti was a Monegasque lawyer of the old school who had on 2 occasions benefited from Poirot's discretion in matters he preferred not to enumerate, and who received the inquiry with the brisk cooperation of a man discharging an obligation. The identity verification service, Marchetti confirmed, was a reputable firm used by the very wealthy to authenticate the backgrounds of prospective partners, employees, or, in certain cases, intimate companions. The service Bellini had commissioned 3 years prior had concerned not Adrian Sato himself, but a subject whose file Sato had provided as the investigative source. The 3 million euros had been paid not for the investigation, but as a settlement, a negotiated sum. The subject of the investigation had contested the findings. An agreement had been reached. The file was sealed. The subject's name, Marchetti said, after a pause that had a financial quality to it, was Ilona Kovac. Poirot thanked him, replaced the receiver, and sat for a moment in the cool of his room. So, 3 years ago, Adrian Sato had brought evidence about Ilona Kovac to Alessandro Bellini. Bellini had commissioned a formal investigation. The investigation had produced findings sufficiently definitive that the subject had negotiated a settlement of 3 million euros to contain them. The file had been sealed. The subject had, presumably, continued her life under a different name. And then, Adrian Sato had appeared at the Hotel Miraggio as Bellini's guest. I already did, he had said. Not I am here, not I have come. I already did. He had returned once before. He had fulfilled some condition of the original agreement, or violated it, or discovered that it had been violated by the other party, and he had returned to address the consequence. The question of who had placed the dining order from Sato's room telephone between the hours of 11 and midnight resolved itself in Poirot's mind with quiet certainty. Sato had placed it himself. See, he had invited someone to dine privately on his balcony with every intention of a frank conversation, and the conversation had been frank in ways he had not anticipated. Poirot put on his hat, went downstairs and knocked on the door of Isabelle Laurent's room. She opened it herself, which was mildly unexpected, and stood looking at him with an expression that combined wariness with something approaching relief, as though she had been waiting for a visit and found the anticipation more tiring than the thing itself. "Come in," she said simply. Her room was orderly and personal in a way the others were not. Books on the side table, actual books with cracked spines. A small framed photograph propped against the lamp. A cardigan hung over the chair with the informality of a room inhabited rather than performed in. Poirot approved of it. He sat and came to the point without the preamble he might have employed elsewhere. "You are writing a memoir, Madame Laurent." She was not surprised. She sat on the edge of the bed and laced her fingers. "Yes." "About your marriage to Alessandro Bellini." "About my life. The marriage is a significant chapter." She looked at him levelly. "It is not a revenge document, if that is what you are inferring. I am not an angry woman, Monsieur Poirot. I am a thorough one." "The distinction does you credit." He regarded her. "In your research, the years before your marriage, did you investigate Bellini's previous relationships?" Something shifted in her composure. Not a crack, but a reorientation. The adjustment of a woman revising her estimate of how much he already knew. "I know he had a companion before me," she said carefully. "A Hungarian woman." She was not discussed. "Her name?" "I was told Elena Varga." "And before she was Elena Varga?" Isabelle looked at him for a long moment. Then she rose and went to the desk, opened a leather document folder, and removed a single sheet of paper which she held for a moment before handing it across. It was a photocopy of an old Hungarian civil registration document. The name on it was Ilona Kovacs. The photograph was small and slightly blurred, but recognizable. A younger face with the same bone structure, the same set of the eyes, none of the performance yet in place. "I found this 4 months ago," Isabelle said, "through a researcher in Budapest. I did not know what to do with it. It seemed, in the context of a memoir about my own life, unnecessarily destructive." She paused. "I am not writing about her. I was not going to use it." Poirot looked at the document for some time. "Did you tell anyone you possessed it?" "No." She returned to the edge of the bed. "No one." Poirot believed her. He handed the document back with care. "You will keep this safe, madame. It is, at this moment, important." He stood to leave and then paused as a thought presented itself. "The photograph on your table. You will forgive an old man his curiosity." She glanced at it. "My son, he is 12. He lives in Paris with my sister during term." "He is the reason you are not more angry," Poirot said. It was not a question. Isabelle looked at the photograph for a moment, with an expression that had nothing performed about it whatsoever. "He is the reason for most things," she said quietly. Poirot went out and closed the door softly behind him. Once in the corridor, he stood still for a moment, assembling. Elena Varga had a documented former identity, known to Bellini for at least 3 years and suppressed at the cost of €3 million. Isabelle Laurent held a corroborating civil document and had told no one. Adrian Sato had been the original source of the information and had returned, under some renewed compulsion, to the scene of its original transaction. And Lucas Duarte, who changed jackets at midnight and made urgent telephone calls to São Paulo creditors, who was charming and bankrupt, and had positioned himself with careful precision at the centre of this gathering. Poirot began to walk toward Duarte's room with the unhurried step of a man who has ceased to speculate and commenced to know. The corridor was cool and quiet. From somewhere below, the sound of the sea. The rich do not kill for money, he had told himself the previous evening. They kill for the things money failed to give them. He knocked and waited and heard footsteps approach from within. It was time to have a different kind of conversation with Monsieur Duarte. Chapter 7. The Worthless Object. Lucas Duarte opened his door with the expression of a man who has been expecting a visit and has spent the intervening time deciding how to receive it. He had settled, apparently, on candour, or at least on the performance of it, which, in Poirot's experience, was not always easy to distinguish from the real article, and was, regardless, informative in its own right. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, and stood aside. The room was larger than Isabelle Laurent's and considerably less personal. The expensive luggage was stacked with geometric precision. The desk held a laptop, 2 telephones, and a legal pad covered in figures that Duarte did not trouble to conceal, perhaps because the figures themselves told the story he had already decided to tell. He sat in the chair by the window and gestured toward the one opposite with the ease of a man on his own territory. The ease, Poirot noted, was slightly in advance of the circumstances. "I expect," Duarte said, "that you know I am in financial difficulty." "I had formed that impression," Poirot agreed pleasantly. "Then I will save us both some time." He laced his fingers over the legal pad with the deliberate openness of a man displaying his hands. "I am restructuring significant debt. The process is uncomfortable but not terminal. I came to this gathering because Alessandro Bellini is a man whose goodwill is commercially valuable, and because I had hoped in an informal setting to raise the question of a bridging investment." He paused. "I did not kill Adrian Sato. I had no reason to. He was, if anything, useful to me." Poirot tilted his head. "Useful in what sense?" Duarte was quiet for a moment, the first genuine hesitation Poirot had observed in him. Adrian knew things, about people, about arrangements. He collected information the way other men collect art, not for display, but for the private pleasure of knowing. He looked at the window. 3 weeks ago in London, he told me something about a fellow investor that resolved a dispute in my favour. I don't know how he knew. He simply did. And he asked nothing in return? Nothing. Duarte said it with the faint puzzlement of a man for whom information has never before been offered without a price. He said that accurate information was simply good for everyone, like clean water. He produced a short sound that was not quite a laugh. I thought he was eccentric. Now I think he was the sanest person in this hotel. Poirot regarded him. The black jacket, the 12 minutes. I would like the truth of it, if you please. Duarte met his eyes with what appeared to be a calculation completed in real time. "I met someone on the lower terrace," he said. "A private meeting. Not related to Sato, not related to whatever happened here. A personal matter that I would prefer to keep personal." "A name," said Poirot, not unkindly. Another pause, shorter than the first. "Elena Varga." The name settled into the room. Poirot absorbed it without visible reaction and waited. "She sent a note to my room during dinner," Duarte continued, "asking me to meet her at midnight on the lower terrace. She said she needed advice about an investment matter and preferred not to ask Bellini. He spread his hands briefly. We spoke for perhaps 8 minutes. She was agitated, more than I had seen her before. She asked whether I knew anything about identity verification services in Monaco. I told her I did not. He looked at Poirot steadily. I changed my jacket because it was cold on the lower terrace, and I had left my overcoat in the wardrobe. The wine story was simpler. Indeed it was, said Poirot. And after your 8 minutes with Madame Varga? She went back inside. I made my telephone call to São Paulo and returned to the terrace. I did not see her again that evening. Poirot stood. He had what he required, which was the confirmation that Elena Varga, on the evening of the murder, had made a private inquiry about the very subject that connected her to the dead man, to her hidden history, and to the Monaco settlement. She had made it to the one person present she considered sufficiently outside the central arrangement to be safely asked. She had been afraid. And fear of a particular variety, the variety that asks questions rather than answering them, told Poirot that she had not, at that point, known what Sato intended to do. He thanked Duarte, advised him once more not to leave the hotel, and went out. In his room he placed the notebook, the receipt, and his own notes in a precise row on the writing table, and stood looking at them for some time. Then he picked up Adrian Sato's notebook and opened it to the back pages, where the documentary research was densest. Names, observations, fragments of overheard conversation, the raw material of a portrait of lives lived at altitude and the private costs thereof. He read it with care, and on the 3rd page from the back he found what he had suspected was there, embedded in 3 lines so understated that a reader moving at speed would have passed them without pause. Elena, Budapest, 1999, the Kovacs family, 3 children. Ilona, the eldest, disappeared from the municipal record in 2001. Presumed emigrated, no further trace under that name. And below it, in handwriting fractionally different, then as though added at a separate sitting. She told me in the 1st year that she did it for survival. I believed her then. I believe her now. The question was never why. The question was always what it cost her. Poirot set the notebook down. He stood at his window and looked at the sea, which continued its vast, indifferent performance beyond the glass. The question was always what it cost her. A man who understood, who had from the beginning understood not only the fact of the deception, but the human being inside it. The young woman from Budapest who had remade herself so thoroughly that the original was almost entirely gone, who had loved that original woman, who had watched the replacement from a distance for 20 years, who had finally come to the place where she was kept in order to offer her not exposure, but a way back, either private dining order, the table set for 2, the champagne and the white truffle risotto on a balcony above the sea. Not a confrontation, an invitation. Poirot turned from the window. At the back of the notebook, behind the last written page, tucked into the fold of the rear cover where the receipt had also been concealed, was a photograph. He had noted its presence on his first examination and left it in place, waiting until he had sufficient context to look at it with proper understanding. He removed it now. It was small, slightly faded at the corners, printed on the matte paper of an earlier decade. 2 young people sat on the steps of a building he did not recognize, a Budapest building probably, stone-faced and ordinary. They were laughing. The young man was recognizably Adrian Sato, and younger, and without the settled quality that maturity had given him, but unmistakably himself. The young woman beside him was laughing with her whole face, without management or calculation, without the practice beauty she would later construct around herself like architecture. She was, even then, extraordinarily lovely. On the back, in the same small, legible hand, Ilona and me. October 1998. Before everything. Poirot held the photograph for a long moment. Before everything. Before the name change. Before the sapphire necklace. Before the silver silk and the managed smile and the €3 million and the sealed file in Monaco. Before Elena Varga existed at all. Two young people on some steps in Budapest, laughing in October, before the world had made its offers, and one of them had accepted. He placed the photograph carefully on the writing table beside the receipt and the notebook and his own notes, and he stood back and regarded the complete arrangement with the quiet attention of a man looking at a finished thing. He knew who had killed Adrian Sato. He had known, he supposed, since Elena Varga had stood at the balustrade and spoken about a man who believed in things even after there was no particular reason to. He had known it in the way one sometimes knows a solution before one can demonstrate it, as a certainty that precedes its own evidence. The evidence was now before him in the row on the writing table. What remained was the matter of proof, which was a different and more delicate problem because the proof required was not the kind that came from laboratories or legal documents. It was the kind that came from a human being choosing, in a particular moment, to tell the truth. And for that, Poirot needed the terrace, the sunset, and everyone assembled beneath it. He straightened his tie, confirmed that his moustaches were impeccable, and went to arrange it. Chapter 8. The Crime of Desire. The afternoon had passed its peak, and the shadows on the Miraggio's terraces were lengthening toward evening when Poirot sent word, through Mei Chen, that he would be grateful for a brief private conversation with Madame Varga before dinner. He chose his words with care, brief and private, and before dinner, which was to say at an hour when the light was still good and the company not yet assembled, and retreat was possible because a woman who believed retreat to be possible was a woman who might, in Poirot's experience, remain in her chair long enough to say something true. She came to the Lemon Garden sitting room at 5:30. She wore the ivory dress again, or one very like it, and she had the sapphire comb in her hair, and her composure around her like a garment, and she sat down across from Poirot with the manner of a woman who has decided in advance exactly how this conversation will proceed. Poirot allowed the silence to settle for a moment. Then he placed the photograph on the table between them, face upward, and said nothing. Elena Varga looked at it. The composure did not shatter. It did not crack or crumble or fall away in the dramatic fashion that such moments produce in fiction. What happened was more particular than that, and more final. It simply stopped, like a clock unwound. The managed grace, the calibrated warmth, the smile maintained through 2 decades of relentless private discipline. All of it ceased at once, and what remained was a woman of perhaps 43, sitting very still in a chair in a lemon garden in southern Italy, looking at a photograph of herself at 20. "Where did you find this?" she said. Her voice was different, quieter, and without its velvet quality. It was, Poirot thought, the voice she had started with. In his notebook, Poirot said gently. He kept it at the back, behind the last page. She did not touch the photograph. She looked at it as one looks at something that cannot be unfound. He came here to give it back to me, she said after a long moment. It was not a question she had known perhaps before she sat down. That was why he came, not to expose me, not to renegotiate the settlement. She closed her eyes briefly. To give it back. I believe so, said Poirot. And to give you, if you wished it, something else. The possibility of being known as you actually are by at least one person who had always known and had never required you to be otherwise. A sound escaped her that was not quite a word. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment, with the absolute, rigid control of a woman who will not weep in front of witnesses. Poirot waited. When she had composed herself, she looked at him with eyes that were bright but steady. I grew up in a 2-room apartment in the 8th district of Budapest, she said. My father drove a tram. My mother worked in a textile factory. We were not unhappy, but I was very beautiful. And in that world, in that time, your beauty was the only currency a girl like me possessed that anyone of consequence would accept. She was not asking for understanding. She was simply stating facts in the manner of a woman who has spent a long time not stating them. Ilona Kovac died in a car accident in Vienna in 2001, she continued. She was a minor aristocrat, distant family, no close relations remaining. I had known her at school. We looked somewhat alike. When I arrived in Vienna after she died and found her documents, I understood what was available to me. She paused. I was 22. I made a decision that a 22-year-old makes, which is to say, I did not fully understand that decisions have a duration. And Adrian, Poirot said quietly. Adrian knew me in Budapest before Vienna. He knew Ilona Kovac was dead, and he knew what I had done. Because I told him. Something moved across her face. He was the only person I ever told. He was that sort of person. You told him things. She looked down at the photograph. He said he understood. He said he would never use it against me. And he never did. In 20 years, he never did. Until 3 years ago, Poirot said, when the Monaco investigation occurred. She looked up sharply. That was not Adrian. That was someone else, a journalist who had found inconsistencies in the Kovac family record. It was Alessandro who commissioned the investigation to protect himself as much as me, and Adrian heard of it and came forward to the investigators to provide his own testimony. Her jaw set. He told them I had assumed the identity with the family's knowledge and blessing. He lied to protect me. The settlement was paid partly to contain what he had fabricated on my behalf. Poirot absorbed this revision to his understanding with the stillness of a man recalculating, and found that the architecture held. The €3 million had purchased not only the suppression of evidence, but the maintenance of a false testimony. Adrian Sato had spent €3 million of Bellini's money protecting a woman who had left him and had asked nothing in return. He came back this time, Poirot said, because something had changed. Isabelle Laurent. The name was flat and certain. I found out 4 months ago that she was writing a memoir and that her researcher had been in Budapest. Adrian found out also. He contacted me. He said he wished to speak in person, away from telephones and intermediaries. He said the photograph was mine and should be returned to me. She stopped. Her hands were very still in her lap. I was afraid. I had been afraid since I heard about the memoir. I did not know what he intended truly. I thought perhaps he had finally decided that 20 years of silence was enough, and that his loyalty had its limit. And so you went to his balcony. The silence that followed was of a different quality from all the others that had preceded it in the investigation. It was dense and final, the silence of a word about to be spoken that cannot be unspoken. I went to his balcony, she said. She said it simply, without the elaborate syntactical maneuvering by which guilty people generally approach confession, and the simplicity of it was, Poirot felt, was entirely in keeping with the woman she had been before the performance began. Ilona Kovac, who had made one enormous decision at 22, and had been living inside its consequences ever since. He showed me the photograph, she said. He said he was giving it to me. He said he had destroyed all other copies. He said Isabel's research could not harm me because the document she held was a civil registration, nothing more, and could not be connected to the living Elena Varga without his testimony, which he would never give. She breathed in slowly. He said I was free. After all of it, he said I was free. Poirot said nothing. And I looked at him, she said, her voice dropping to something barely above the threshold of sound. And I looked at the life I had made, and I understood that it was over regardless, that it had been over the moment he walked onto this terrace, not because he would destroy it, because he had looked at me and seen through all of it in the way only he ever could, and I could not bear to be seen. She looked at her hands. The poison was in my evening bag. I had carried it since I learned he would be here. I had not decided to use it. I told myself I had not decided. The lemon garden was very quiet. Somewhere above them, a window shutter moved in the sea breeze and was still. He was offering you everything you had ever needed, Poirot said, and the one thing you could not receive was the truth of what you had become. She did not answer, which was itself an answer. Poirot rose. He stood for a moment, looking down at the photograph on the table, at the two young people laughing on steps in Budapest in October 1998. And he felt something that he would not have described to anyone and did not attempt to name. I will ask Mademoiselle Chen to telephone Inspector Ferrara, he said. I think it would be best if you remained here until he arrives. Yes, said Elena Varga, or perhaps Ilona Kovac. In this moment, the distinction had ceased to be meaningful. She sat in the lemon garden as the shadows lengthened and did not move, and on the table before her the photograph lay face upward in the fading light, two young people laughing before everything. Poirot went to find Mei Chen. Chapter 9. The Value of Truth. The terrace of the Hotel Miraggio at 6 o'clock in the evening was, as it had been on the first night, very beautiful. The light had moved from gold to amber and was beginning its slow dissolution toward rose. The sea below had deepened to violet at the horizon and retained its impossible blue closer in, as though it could not quite relinquish the day. The jasmine was at its most insistent in the early evening air. The candles on the terrace tables were freshly lit, their flames standing perfectly upright in the absence of wind. Poirot had asked Mei Chen to assemble the guests at 6. He had chosen the terrace deliberately, the same table, the same arrangement of chairs, the same view that had framed the first evening's performance. The symmetry pleased him, though he would have been the first to admit that symmetry was a personal indulgence rather than a strictly necessary element of justice. They came one by one, with the particular wariness of people who understand that an assembly has been called for a purpose, and that the purpose will not be comfortable. Alessandro Bellini arrived first, because men of his kind generally do, and stood at the balustrade for a moment with his back to the table, before taking his seat with the controlled composure of a man conserving energy for a contest whose nature he has not yet fully identified. He did not ask where Elena was, which told Poirot that he had already noted her absence, and had decided that noting it aloud would not serve him. Oliver came next and sat without looking at his father. He had the reddened eyes of a young man who had spent the afternoon honestly rather than strategically, and he carried a stillness about him that was different from his earlier unhappiness, more settled, dim as though grief, honestly inhabited, had provided him with something he had previously lacked. Isabelle Laurent arrived in a dark dress, took the chair furthest from Bellini, and folded her hands in her lap with the undemonstrative composure that Poirot had come to regard as her particular form of courage. She glanced once at the empty chair where Eleanor would have sat, and then looked at Poirot with steady, questioning eyes. Lucas Duarte came last among the seated guests, looking somewhat diminished from the urbane figure of the first evening, as though a quantity of the social lacquer had been removed by the day's events, and what remained beneath it was more ordinary, and, Poirot thought, not unattractive in its comparative honesty. He took his seat and poured himself water with the care of a man who has decided that clarity is currently more useful than courage. Mei Chen stood to one side, her folio open, her expression professionally neutral. Inspector Ferrara was positioned discreetly near the inner doors, with the stillness of a man instructed to observe and not to speak until invited. Poirot stood at the head of the table. He did not begin immediately. He looked at each person present for a moment, with the mild, unhurried attention that those who knew him understood was anything but mild, and he allowed the silence of the beautiful evening to do some of the preparatory work. "My friends," he said at last, in the tone of a man addressing people he has come to know rather well in a short time, and finds on balance worth the effort. We have been together at this hotel for 2 days. In that time a man has been killed, several untruths have been maintained with considerable skill, and a great many expensive things have been consumed. He paused. I will now tell you what happened. I ask only that you listen, and that you resist, if you are able, the very human impulse to interrupt before I have finished. Bellini's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Poirot began with the beginning, which was not the first evening on the terrace, but a much earlier evening in Budapest. A city he conjured briefly and with precision. 2 students, the particular poverty of the artistically minded young, a young woman of exceptional beauty and no prospects, and the single enormous decision that had redirected the entire trajectory of her life. He spoke of Vienna, of Ilona Kovacs, of the assumption of an identity that was not, he was careful to note, taken from a living person, but appropriated from a dead one, which did not make it legal, but gave it a moral complexity that simple theft did not possess. He watched Bellini absorb the name Ilona Kovacs and saw the precise degree to which it was not new to him. He spoke of Adrian Sato's 20 years of silence, of his testimony in Monaco that had been false and protective rather than damaging, of the €3 million that had been spent purchasing the suppression of evidence that Sato had himself fabricated on Elena's behalf. Oliver turned to look at his father at the mention of the 3 million. Bellini did not look back. Monsieur Sato returned to this hotel, Poirot continued, because he had learned that Madame Laurent's research in Budapest had brought her close to the same discovery that had been suppressed 3 years before. He came because the protection he had constructed was becoming unreliable, and he wished to offer something more permanent. He brought the photograph that was the last physical connection between Elena Varga and Ilona Kovacs, and he brought his intention to give it to her and to tell her that she was free, that his testimony, the only testimony of a living witness who had known both identities, would never be given. He let the full weight of this settle. He invited her to dinner on his private balcony. He poured champagne and ordered white truffle risotto, and he laid the table for two above the sea. And he told a woman he had loved since Budapest that after 20 years she could put the performance down. Isabelle Laurent's breath released very quietly beside him. She had carried the means of his death in her evening bag since she learned he would attend this gathering, Poirot said. She had not decided to use it. This I believe. A woman who has decided does not meet her intended victim for dinner and listen while he offers her the one thing she cannot accept. She went to the balcony in fear and came away having done something that fear does not adequately explain and does not begin to excuse. He paused, and when he resumed, his voice was quieter. The little grey cells, they are often engaged with the question of motive. And in this case, the motive is not, as one might superficially suppose, the protection of an identity or the preservation of a comfortable life. Madame Varga had the means to rebuild, had she chosen. The motive is rather something more interior than that. Monsieur Sato looked at her and saw Ilona Kovacs, and in seeing her truly, he made Elena Varga impossible to continue. She killed him because he loved her in a way that her constructed life had no room to contain. He placed his hands flat on the table. Madame Varga is currently in the Lemon Garden sitting room with Inspector Ferrara's colleague. She has made a full confession. She will not be joining us this evening. The silence on the terrace was of a piece with the evening itself, large and complete, and without any of the decorative elements that had covered its surface on the first night. Bellini sat very still. Whatever he was experiencing, that he was experiencing it privately and with the discipline of a man for whom privacy was the one remaining luxury. He looked, Poirot thought, not guilty and not grieving, but simply older, as though the afternoon had added a decade to him while he was not attending. Oliver put his hands over his face for a moment. Then he took them away and looked at the sea. Isabelle Laurent looked at Poirot with an expression he found difficult to classify, something between recognition and sadness, the look of a woman who has suspected a version of this for some time and finds the confirmation no less painful for being expected. "The memoir," Poirot said to her gently, "the document in Budapest. In due course, these matters will be examined by the appropriate authorities. I would ask that you consider carefully in the coming weeks the difference between what you have a right to publish and what it would be kind to publish." She held his gaze. "I have always known the difference," she said. "I have simply been waiting to decide which mattered more." "And now?" She looked at the empty chair. "Now I think I know." Poirot nodded once and didn't press further. Lucas Duarte said, from his end of the table, in a voice stripped of all its professional finish, "She was magnificent, you know. Whatever else she was, truly magnificent." No one disputed it. The evening continued its movement toward dark. The candle flames remained perfectly upright. Below the balustrade, the sea had gone entirely to violet, and the first stars were becoming visible above the black silhouette of the cliff. Poirot remained at the head of the table and allowed the gathering, such as it still was, to find its own conclusion, because there were things that could not be improved upon by further words. And this, he had come to understand in a long life, was one of them. He looked at the empty chair where Eleanor Varga had sat on the first evening, and he thought about a woman laughing on steps in Budapest in October 1998. Before everything. He thought that everything was an awfully large price to pay. Presently he excused himself and went inside. Chapter 10. After the gold rush. She was taken away at sunrise. Poirot did not watch from the terrace. He was at his window, which looked not over the sea but over the hotel's service courtyard, a practical rectangle of stone where deliveries arrived and linen was collected, and the machinery of luxury conducted its honest, unremarkable operations. He watched two pigeons dispute a bread crust with the focused seriousness that pigeons bring to such matters, and he listened to the car leave, and when the sound of its engine had diminished to nothing in the morning air, he poured himself a second coffee and drank it, standing at the window. The Mediterranean light at that hour was still thin, more silver than gold, and it had the quality of light that has not yet decided what the day will require of it. Inspector Ferrara had conducted himself throughout with a professional decency that Poirot found creditable. He had taken the confession without theatrical apparatus. He had asked precise questions and recorded the answers with the care of a man who understood that he was handling something that would require careful handling in every stage of its subsequent journey. Before he left, he shook Poirot's hand with a grip that communicated respect without requiring words, and Poirot received it in the same spirit. The hotel was very quiet. It had the particular quiet of a place from which something has been removed. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of aftermath, the absence that follows an event rather than preceding one. The staff moved through it with the subdued efficiency of people who have been trained to manage every variety of difficulty and who are now managing this one, adjusting fresh flowers in the entrance hall, resetting tables on the terrace, performing the small necessary acts of restoration that a hotel performs after something has disrupted its surface. Poirot appreciated the flowers. Order imposed on disorder was not pretense. It was, he believed, a form of respect. But he finished his coffee, set the cup at its precise angle on its saucer, and went downstairs. Alessandro Bellini was in the dining room, sitting alone at a small table near the window with an untouched breakfast before him, looking out at the sea. He had aged, Poirot thought again, though by the morning light it was a different quality of aging from the previous evenings. The night had resolved something in him, some posture of defended authority that had been his habitual attitude to the world, and what remained looked less like a man stripped of his defences, and more like a man who had, after considerable resistance, laid them down voluntarily. Poirot sat across from him without being invited, as had become his practice in this hotel. Bellini looked at him without surprise. "I paid €3 million," he said without preface, or to contain something that had already been contained for 15 years. by a man who asked nothing. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I have been sitting here considering what that says about me. And what conclusions have you reached? Poirot asked. That I am a man who understands transactions and very little else. He said it without self-pity, which gave it a weight that self-pity would have dissolved. Adrian Sato protected her from loyalty. I protected her from self-interest. I did not want a scandal. I did not want my name adjacent to a fraud of that nature. I told myself I was protecting her. He paused. I was protecting the investment. Poirot regarded him. And Oliver. Something shifted in Bellini's face. Oliver, he said, and the word carried a freight that the man had evidently not anticipated when he spoke it. He will make the documentary, Poirot said. I think you know this. Yes. Bellini looked at the sea again. I have been thinking about that also. A pause of some length. Adrian told him the truth was the most valuable thing he could offer anyone. Oliver told me this last night. At some length. The ghost of an expression moved across his face that might, in a different man, have been called rueful. He is 24 years old, and he is already more honest than I have been in 30 years of business. He had an honest friend, Poirot said simply. Bellini nodded once, the nod of a man accepting a verdict. He looked back at the untouched breakfast and then at Poirot. Will you eat? I have had coffee, Poirot said. I will shortly have eggs. I find that eggs, properly prepared, are reliable in a way that very little else is. He left Bellini at his window and went to order his breakfast. Isabelle Laurent was in the entrance hall with her luggage when Poirot came down again an hour later. She was dressed for travel, and her face had the composed, forward-looking quality of a woman who has concluded one chapter and knows, at least approximately, what she intends the next one to contain. Paris, she said when Poirot appeared. My son has a recital on Thursday. He plays the violin, adequately but with great conviction. A most admirable combination, Poirot said. And the memoir? She considered. I will write about my marriage and my career than in the things I have learned about the sort of person who accumulates that much money and what it does to them. She drew on her gloves with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has made up her mind. I will not write about Elena Varga. The courts will do whatever they will do. I need not add to it. Poirot inclined his head. Madame Laurent, it has been, despite everything, an instruction. She looked at him with the dry, unsentimental humour that had been present beneath her composed surface from the beginning. For me also, Monsieur Poirot. She held out her hand, and he took it briefly. I hope your eggs were satisfactory. They were excellent, Poirot said with complete sincerity. He found Lucas Duarte on the lower terrace. He's leaning on the balustrade in the morning sun with the relaxed posture of a man conducting a minor rehabilitation of his self-estimate. He was on the telephone again, but the quality of the conversation had changed from the previous day's urgency to something more provisional, more exploratory, the tone of a man discussing possibilities rather than managing catastrophes. When he ended the call, he turned to find Poirot beside him and did not appear startled. A potential investor, he said. In São Paulo, it may come to nothing. Or it may not, Poirot said equably. Duarte looked at him. You never seriously suspected me. I suspected everyone with the degree of seriousness appropriate to the evidence, Poirot replied. which was true and not wholly satisfying as an answer, and they both knew it. You changed your jacket and conducted midnight meetings, Monsieur Duarte, and you are the sort of man who causes other people to construct narratives around him. This is not entirely your fault. Duarte absorbed this. Adrian said something similar to me in London. He said I performed confidence the way Elena performed happiness, because we had both started from nothing, and neither of us had quite finished being frightened. He looked at the sea. I was annoyed at the time. Now, I think I would give a considerable sum to hear him say another uncomfortable thing. That, said Poirot, is perhaps the finest tribute you could offer him. Oliver Bellini he found last, sitting in the lemon garden on the bench where they had spoken the previous day. He had Adrian Sato's camera case open on the bench beside him and was examining the camera within it with the careful attention of someone learning the weight of an unfamiliar object. He looked up when Poirot sat beside him, and his face had about it the specific seriousness of young people who have passed through something that has rearranged their interior furniture. Dad said I could use the Miraggio for location filming, he said, if I wanted. Poirot raised his eyebrows very slightly. And do you want? I don't know yet. I think I want to start somewhere smaller. He turned the camera in his hands with growing steadiness. Adrian always said the most interesting stories are the ones people are most afraid to tell about themselves. That was going to be the documentary. He paused. I think it still should be. I think so too, said Poirot. He sat with the young man for a few minutes in the lemon-scented quiet, which required no further conversation and received none, and then he rose and went upstairs to pack. His train departed at 2 from Salerno, and he would need to arrange a car. His luggage, when he opened the wardrobe, was in the meticulous order in which he always left it. Everything folded and placed as it should be, every item in its appointed position. He packed with the same deliberateness with which he unpacked, giving each thing its proper consideration, and when the cases were closed and latched, he straightened and looked once around the room to confirm that nothing had been left behind. The room gave him nothing back but its own impersonal beauty. Already in the way of such rooms, it had resumed its distance. He carried his own cases down, declining the offered assistance, and settled his account with Mei Chen at the desk. She processed the transaction with her customary efficiency, and then, before he turned to go, she said, without looking up from the ledger, "He was a good man." "Yes," said Poirot. "He was." She nodded once, made a final annotation, and closed the ledger with finality. The car took him down the hairpin road to Salerno along the coast road, and for the first several minutes, Poirot looked back at the Miraggio above them on its promontory, white and perfect and reduced by distance to something that looked, against the blue of the sky and the bluer sea beneath, exactly like a painting of itself. Then the road curved and it was gone. He faced forward, adjusted his hat, and considered the journey. At Salerno station he found a corner seat in the first-class carriage, and a copy of a newspaper, and the prospect of a luncheon trolley in approximately 2 hours. The train filled gradually around him with the ordinary population of the ordinary world, families and businessmen and students, and an elderly priest who fell asleep before the train had left the platform, with the practiced ease of a man on excellent terms with his own conscience. Poirot opened his newspaper, closed it again, and folded his hands on his knee. He thought about a cheap leather notebook and an old photograph, and a table set for 2 above the sea. He thought about the many forms that love takes when it has been kept in a closed space for a very long time. How some of them are generous and sustaining, and some of them are, in the end, incompatible with the continuation of another person's life. He thought about a young woman in Budapest deciding to become someone else, and about the price of that decision paid across 20 years in the currency of performance. And he thought that the saddest part was not the crime, which was terrible, but the moment on the balcony before it, when a man had told a woman she was free, and she had been unable to believe him. The train moved out of Salerno into the bright southern afternoon. Poirot looked out the window at the passing landscape, the white buildings and the terracotta roofs and the dark cypress trees standing in the heat like exclamation points. And he thought about eggs, which were on the luncheon menu and which he intended to order and which were, he had always maintained, and one of the more reliable pleasures available to a man of order and method moving through an uncertain world. The world passed the window in its large, indifferent beauty. Hercule Poirot settled more precisely into his seat and waited, with tranquil patience, for the luncheon trolley.